Welcome to another TrueRadar episode. Before we step into tonight's mystery, take a slow, deep breath. Let go of whatever is on your mind right now. Feel the tension leaving your shoulders and just allow yourself to sink deeply into your mattress. Pull the blankets up heavy and warm around you and leave the day completely behind. You are safe here. Close your eyes. Let the steady, soothing sound of the rain wash away the outside world. And as you drift closer to sleep, let's unlock the door to tonight's story. Winter in Plainfield, Wisconsin, is not merely a season, it is a geologic force. It descends in late November, stripping the trees of their color and freezing the marshlands into brittle, jagged expanses of white and gray. The cold here does not just chill the skin, it sinks into the bone. It drives the townspeople indoors, behind thick wooden doors and frosted glass panes, leaving the rural roots empty and dead. In the deep winter of the 1950s, the silence that fell over the isolated farmland was total. It was the kind of silence that rings in the ears, the kind that, if you listen to it long enough, begins to whisper back. A few miles outside the town limits, at the end of a long, rutted dirt road, sat a sprawling 155-acre farm. From the outside, it was entirely unremarkable. A large, weather-beaten wooden house, a sagging barn, and a summer kitchen with peeling paint. This was the Gein property. If you asked anyone at the local hardware store, or the feed and seed about the man who lived there, they would likely look right past you, their eyes scanning the snow-covered street. Ed Gein was a fixture of the landscape, yet entirely invisible. He was a small, wiry man with a crooked, nervous smile, his eyes perpetually fixed on the floorboards. He was the man you hired to patch a leaky roof, or pull a rotted stump out of the frozen ground. He would do the work, pocket his few crumpled dollars, and walk the miles back to his empty farmhouse. He was considered harmless. The town's quiet eccentric. A lonely bachelor who had never quite found his footing after his mother passed away. But the people of Plainfield could not see through the walls of that farmhouse. They had no idea what was taking root in the dark. To understand what happened in the silence of that house, you have to look at the soil from which Ed Gein grew. He was meticulously cultivated. The gardener was his mother, Augusta. Augusta Gein did not view the world with a mother's warmth. She viewed it through the punishing, narrow lens of a wrathful god. To her, the bustling towns and cities of the world were open sewers of sin and temptation. She bought the farm in Plainfield for one specific reason: to build a fortress. She wanted to isolate her husband, George, and her two young sons, Henry and Edward, from the creeping rot of humanity. Every afternoon, the routine was unbroken. Augusta would sit in her high-backed wooden chair in the downstairs parlor, the heavy leather spine of the family Bible resting on her lap. She did not read her boys' stories of grace or salvation. Her voice, sharp as a cracked whip, echoed through the drafty hallways, reciting passages of divine retribution. Floods that wiped out humanity, plagues that rotted the flesh from the bone. She would fix her piercing gaze on her sons and tell them that men were inherently weak, and that all women, every single one of them, except for her, were vessels of corruption. Her husband, George, was a ghost in his own home. Beaten down by the unforgiving dirt of the farm and his wife's iron will, he spent his days working and his nights seeking the dark oblivion of alcohol. When he died of heart failure in 1940, his absence barely registered in the suffocating routine of the farmhouse. Then there was Henry. Older and slightly more defiant, Henry sometimes pushed back against Augusta's suffocating grip. He would occasionally speak out against her, a transgression that Ed found utterly horrifying. To Ed, his mother was not a parent. She was an infallible deity. To question her was to invite damnation. In the spring of 1944, a violent brush fire broke out on the property. The wind whipped the flames, turning the dry fields into a chaotic wall of thick, choking smoke. The local fire department arrived, beating back the fire alongside the two brothers. When the flames were finally subdued and the smoke began to settle over the blackened earth, Henry was missing. The police organized a search party, sweeping the scorched marshland with lanterns. But it was Ed who eventually led them directly to his brother. He walked through the dark, smoking brush, seemingly unbothered, and pointed. Henry was lying face down in the ashes. The coroner officially ruled it asphyxiation, but whispered rumors circulated about the strange, unexplained bruises found on Henry's head. No charges were ever filed. The investigation quietly closed. With Henry gone, the population of the fortress dwindled down to 2. It was just Ed and his god. But fortresses eventually crumble from within. In 1945, Augusta suffered a severe stroke, leaving her paralyzed. For months, Ed became her sole caretaker, nursing her with a frantic, desperate devotion. He fed her, bathed her, and listened to her weakened but still sharp rebukes. When she suffered a second stroke and passed away just before the end of the year, the foundation of Ed Gein's reality completely fractured. He was 39 years old. The guiding star that had dictated his every thought, movement, and belief had suddenly burned out, leaving him in total, suffocating darkness. In the days following Augusta's funeral, Ed walked through the large, echoing farmhouse. The wooden floorboards groaned under his boots. He went to the upstairs bedrooms, took a heavy iron hammer and a handful of nails, and systematically sealed the doors shut. He walked down to the parlor, the room where she had read the Bible to him, and closed it off forever. He preserved her bedroom immaculately, a frozen shrine of devotion. He fluffed her pillows. He left her belongings exactly where she had placed them last. He locked the door, leaving the room to gather dust in perfect, undisturbed silence. He shrunk his own world down to a tiny, squalid bedroom off the kitchen, and the summer shed out back, while the rest of the house remained a pristine tomb to Augusta. Ed's living quarters descended into unimaginable filth. Empty tin cans, rotting garbage, and rusted tools piled up in the corners. The smell of unwashed clothes and decaying food filled the cramped space. But it was what he did at night. By the flickering, greasy light of a kerosene lamp that began to twist the fabric of his mind, Ed began to read. He did not read the Bible. He ordered medical encyclopedias. He pored over intricate, disturbing textbooks on human anatomy. He read pulp magazines featuring stories of headhunters in the South Seas, of wartime medical experiments, of exhumations and the mechanics of death. He became fascinated by the physical reality of the human body once the spark of life had been extinguished. His obsession with the dead took root deeply and quietly. The local cemetery, where he had laid his mother to rest, was only a few miles away. In the absolute silence of his squalid kitchen, he began to realize that the ground was full of people who would not judge him. They would not abandon him. They were silent, compliant, and waiting. He started reading the local obituaries, his eyes scanning the black and white columns of the newspaper with the meticulous, calculating gaze of a man making a grocery list. He was not looking for just anyone. He sought out the graves of middle-aged women. Women who, in the dark, under the pale light of the moon, might resemble the one person he had lost. He waited for the darkest nights. He would bundle himself up against the freezing Wisconsin wind, take a heavy steel shovel from the summer kitchen, and make the solitary trek down the empty dirt roads to the graveyard. It is incredibly difficult to unearth a coffin by hand. The winter frost turns the top layer of Wisconsin soil into a solid, unyielding block of ice. The physical labor required is agonizing, but Ed was driven by a compulsion that bypassed physical exhaustion. He would stand in the pitch black, the only sound the rhythmic, dull thud of his shovel hitting the frozen dirt, his breath pluming in the freezing air like smoke. He would dig until his shovel hit the hollow wood of the coffin lid. He would pry it open with a crowbar, the wood splintering loudly in the quiet graveyard. And then he would reach into the dark. He worked with a disturbing, methodical precision. When he had what he came for, he would carefully, meticulously fill the grave back in. He smoothed the dirt over, raking it so that the next morning, the grieving families who came to leave flowers would never know that their loved one's eternal rest had been violated. He would carry his burlap sacks back to the farmhouse, slipping into the summer kitchen like a shadow. In his fractured, deteriorating mind, Ed was not committing a desecration. He was a craftsman. He was attempting to build a bridge back to the only reality he had ever understood. Inside the squalor of his kitchen, he began to experiment. He learned how to preserve what he had taken. He crafted objects out of the remnants he stole from the earth. He was constructing a new macabre environment where he was entirely in control, surrounded by the silent, unjudging pieces of the dead. He wanted to crawl out of his own skin and into theirs. But the graves, eventually, were not enough. The dead were cold. They were incomplete. The compulsion that whispered to him in the dark grew louder, more demanding, and impossible to ignore. The line between the cemetery and the town began to blur. November 16th, 1957. It was the opening day of deer hunting season. In rural Wisconsin, this was practically a holiday. The woods were full of men in heavy wool coats, rifles slung over their shoulders. The streets of Plainfield were unusually quiet. Bernice Warden, a highly respected 58-year-old widow, was running her hardware store on Main Street. She was a practical, sharp woman who knew everyone in town. The store smelled of machine oil, sawdust, and old paper. Late that afternoon, Bernice's son, Frank, who served as the local deputy sheriff, returned from a hunting trip and stopped by the store. As he approached, he noticed something strange. The front door was unlocked, but the lights were off. The store was completely empty. Frank walked behind the heavy wooden counter. The metal cash register was gone. And there, stark against the dusty floorboards, was a streak of dark, wet blood. It trailed out from behind the counter and disappeared out the back door into the alleyway. Frank's blood ran cold. His training kicked in, his eyes scanning the counter for anything out of place. He found his mother's sales ledger book lying open. There was only one entry written for that morning. The final receipt was for a half-gallon of antifreeze. Frank did not have to guess who had bought it. The evening before, Ed Gein had lingered in the store, shuffling his feet, asking Bernice if she would be opening early the next day because he needed antifreeze for his truck. Frank immediately contacted Sheriff Arthur Schley. They did not suspect Ed of anything horrific. Ed was the town oddball. They assumed perhaps he had witnessed a robbery. Or perhaps, in his bumbling way, he had been involved in an accident and panicked. By the time the sheriff and his deputies drove out to the Gein property, the sun had fully set. The farm was swallowed by the dark. There were no lights shining through the frosted windows. The silhouette of the house loomed against the night sky, silent and imposing. Sheriff Schley and Captain Lloyd Schaufurster stepped out of their cruisers, their boots crunching on the frozen gravel. The air was bitterly cold. They walked past the dark, silent windows of the main house and approached the attached summer kitchen. Schley unhooked the metal latch. It gave way with a sharp squeak. He pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside, clicking on his metal flashlight. The beam of light cut through the profound darkness. The air inside the shed was heavy. It smelled intensely of damp earth, rotting wood, and something sharply metallic and raw. The flashlight beam swept across the chaotic mess of the room. Piles of rusty farm equipment, discarded garbage, and old newspapers. And then, the beam caught something hanging from the heavy wooden rafters. At first, Schley's mind simply refused to process the image. It was hunting season. It was incredibly common to see a deer, dressed out and hanging upside down by its hind legs, waiting to be butchered. His brain desperately tried to tell him that is what he was looking at. But as the flashlight beam steadied, illuminating the horrific reality in the center of the room, the illusion shattered. It was not a deer. It was Bernice Warden. The deputies stumbled backward out of the shed, the freezing air hitting their lungs as they reeled from the shock. They frantically called for backup. Within the hour, dozens of heavily armed officers descended on the quiet property, tearing through the silence with flashing red lights and shouting voices. They breached the main farmhouse, kicking in the doors to the rooms Ed had inhabited. What they found inside the cramped, filthy kitchen and his tiny bedroom was a catalogue of horrors so profound it would permanently scar the psyche of the nation. They found the remnants of the graves. They found household items fashioned from human bone. They found chairs meticulously upholstered with human skin. They found the carefully preserved faces of the women he had stolen from the earth, mounted like macabre trophies. They found a house that had been transformed into a physical manifestation of a completely shattered mind. And behind a locked door, they found the parlor, pristine, untouched by the madness, waiting perfectly for Augusta to return. They found Ed later that evening, sitting quietly at a neighbor's house, eating dinner as if he did not have a care in the world. When the officers arrived to arrest him, he did not fight. He did not run. He simply went quiet, his eyes dropping back down to the floorboards. Under questioning, the full, staggering scope of his reality poured out. He spoke in a mumbling, detached voice. He admitted to the murder of Bernice Warden. He admitted to the murder of a local tavern owner named Mary Hogan 3 years prior. A woman who had simply vanished from her bar, leaving only a pool of blood behind. He calmly explained his midnight trips to the cemetery. He described his gruesome craftsmanship with a chilling flatness, like a carpenter explaining how to build a cabinet. The trial of Ed Gein was a formality. The facts were undeniable, but the man sitting in the courtroom was entirely detached from the moral framework of human society. He was diagnosed with profound schizophrenia. He was found entirely unfit to stand trial for murder, legally insane, and committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. And it was there, within the sterile, fluorescently lit walls of the asylum, that a strange thing happened. The monster of Plainfield simply faded away. Free from the crushing isolation of the farm, free from the ghostly, tyrannical grip of his mother, Ed became a model patient. He was docile. He was incredibly polite to the nurses. He read magazines. He learned to operate the shortwave radio. He looked forward to his meals. The madness that had driven him to dig through the frozen earth and commit unspeakable acts in the dark completely evaporated. He was once again just Ed, harmless, quiet. He died in 1984 of respiratory failure at the age of 77. They brought his body back to Plainfield. They buried him in the town cemetery, lowering him into the very soil he used to prowl through in the dead of night. His grave was placed right next to Augusta. The farmhouse itself did not survive him. A year after his arrest, while the town was still reeling from the media circus and the trauma, the Gein property caught fire in the middle of the night. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the blaze was an inferno, completely consuming the house, the shed, and the terrible secrets woven into the wood. The cause of the fire was never officially determined, but it was widely accepted that the townspeople had set it ablaze, desperate to purge the physical nightmare from their landscape. The ashes eventually washed away in the rain. The dirt settled. The sprawling fields grew back over the scorched earth. But if you drive out to that stretch of road in Plainfield today, long after the sun has gone down, you can still feel it. When the winter frost hardens the ground and the wind dies down, the silence returns. When you close your eyes tonight, sinking into the comfort of your bed, listening to the steady, rhythmic sound of the rain against the glass, take a moment to appreciate the safety of your walls. Remember how quickly the mundane world we know can slip away. The line between a quiet, ordinary life and an unimaginable nightmare is not a wide chasm. Sometimes it is as thin as a locked door in a silent house at the end of a long, frozen dirt road.